Welcome to Business Line's State of the Economy podcast, where you'll find insight, analysis, and the story behind the numbers.
Hello and welcome to the State of the Economy podcast. I'm Jyothi Datta. So, the last few weeks have seen many people take a closer look at their medicines, and this follows a report from the National Drug Regulator on NSQs, that is, not of standard quality drugs, which hauled up about 50 samples saying that they were kind of substandard. Now, that in turn led to a larger conversation on counterfeits and spurious drugs, and unfortunately, all of these terms started getting used interchangeably when in fact they mean very different things. So, to pick these apart and explain that, what is an NSQ and what are the other terms that were used, what does it mean in terms of industry compliances and practices, we have with us today Mr. Rishi Agrawal, CEO and co-founder of TeamLease RegTech, that works on helping companies work with their compliances. So thank you so much, Rishi, for being here today.
Well, Jyoti, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me here.
So getting straight into it. So we had, the national regulator, the CDSCO, that's the Central Drug Standards Control Organization, come out with its regular report on NSQs. And just picking up on the last report that created a stir among consumers, now we saw large drug companies sort of distance themselves from some of the samples that were picked, the substandard samples, saying that this was not theirs. They were, in fact, possibly counterfeit or spurious. Now, for a person sitting at home taking a diabetes medicine or a BP medicine, or for someone with a child who has just been given a pediatric antibiotic, what does all this mean to them?
It just erodes their trust in the way the system is functioning. I don't expect them to have the savviness or expertise to look at a drug and identify whether it is genuine or counterfeit or spurious or NSQ or what have you. So it just means that our system has to function better to stand up to the trust that they have reposed in the system. That's what it means, the way I look at it.
Right. So how would you define, or if you can explain to us, what is an NSQ drug? What do you mean when you say counterfeit? What is a spurious drug? What is the difference between all of this?
Sure. Now, before that, Jyoti, it's very important for our viewers to understand the size of India's pharmaceutical industry and its growing importance, not just within the domestic economy, but the global economy. We are a veritable pharmacy to the world today. We serve one of the largest domestic markets of the world's most populous nation. Not just that, we serve over 60% of the vaccine needs of the world, 40% of the generic drugs within the United States, and 25% of the generic drugs within the UK. The country has over 3,000 companies and over 10,000 industrial units when it was last counted. India is the largest, is a country or home to the largest number of manufacturing locations approved by the US FDA outside of the United States. So you can see that that is the growing importance. That's the importance of the country's pharmaceutical sector today. Now, your specific question on making sure that our viewers are able to differentiate between counterfeit, spurious, and NSQs, and these are often misunderstood. They are used interchangeably. Let's look at some of these definitions. What is a counterfeit medicine? A counterfeit medicine is one which is falsified drug that closely actually resembles the generic medicine. Healthcare professionals, they struggle to distinguish them. They are manufactured by unlicensed manufacturers. They are created with an intention to deceive. Here, the source is compromised. So somebody is saying that you're buying a drug A, which is manufactured by company B, whereas there is no manufacturer B which is manufacturing that. There is some third party, which is a counterfeit medicine being created by an unlicensed player, clearly with the intention to deceive. The source is completely compromised. There are no quality controls. There is no testing. All of that is a problem with counterfeit. Now, let us look at spurious. Spurious is basically an imitation drug. These are product formulations which are manufactured concealing the product's true identity. These are products which are made to resemble another drug, especially some popular brand. The The way the manufacturer is working is to deceive the buyer and cash in on the popularity of the original product. The product may or may not contain the active ingredients that it says on the label. Now here, there is no intention to deceive because the manufacturer is not claiming to be somebody else. The manufacturer is putting their name there. But the quality is substandard because they've not gone through any of the rigorous manufacturing, storage, or transportation standards. So spurious is different from counterfeit. In counterfeit, the source is compromised. In spurious, the source is not compromised, but intention, it is created to confuse, so that, like, you may have seen a popular brand of water which has a particular branding and the bottle looks in a particular way, and you go to a little bit of a rural place and they'll give you the same looking bottle, the same feel, the same color schemes, the same looking label, but only the spelling will be off by one alphabet. Now, that is a case of spurious drug where everything looks similar to the original drug, but in reality it is manufactured by someone else, and it may or may not have the active ingredients that it claims. Now, the third one is NSQ, which actually is a different ballgame altogether. NSQ drugs are, NSQ stands for not of standard quality, and these are drugs that fail to meet the quality standards which are set by national and international organizations. Now, the unfortunate part is that they come from the legitimate manufacturers. So the source is not compromised here. The manufacturer is a legitimate one which has the right certifications, but the output, which is the drug, fails to meet regulatory standards. Now, that's the problem here, that whatever the reasons are behind the scenes, and let's talk about some of those reasons, such as improper storage conditions, not following the GDP, which is good distribution practices, not following the GSPs, which is good storage practices, poor testing, broken manufacturing process, poor quality control, or compromised ingredients, which can often result in low quality. So NSQ is very different from spurious and counterfeit. I hope I'm able to clarify and differentiate between the three different problems.
Absolutely, yes. So, you pointed out that NSQs, are more from the manufacturing point of view where they don't make the cut or storage or distribution. Now, the understanding that is sometimes, communicated to people is that it is not as life-threatening and or not as troublesome as counterfeits and spurious. So, what does one begin to understand? Are there multiple shades to quality and effectiveness, and is that okay from an consumer?
See, let's start from the consumer's perspective. Nothing is okay, whether it is counterfeit or it is spurious or NSQ, all of them are a problem. But the way to deal with that problem are different from each other. When you deal with NSQs, they are primarily the responsibility of the manufacturer. The industry, the sector gets a bad name because of NSQs, because a few manufacturing plants don't meet the quality standards, the kind of machines, the kind of process controls, the quality controls, the testing standards, the quality of ingredients, the quality of legal metrology or weights and measurements which are being used is not proper. So the effectiveness of these drugs is compromised. Now imagine there's a pediatric patient which is suffering from, say, dengue, and a physician or a pediatrician recommends a particular drug, and imagine it is an NSQ. Now, we are saying that it may not be life-threatening, but the pediatrician is assuming that this drug will do the magic for the child, and this drug has spurious content, NSQ. It's a poor standard or poor quality control on this drug, and the drug is not as effective for 3-4 days, and the patient worsens. I'm sure it can become life-threatening, very soon.
Correct.
So to me, from a consumer's point of view, all of them are a problem, but their solutions are different from each other.
That brings me to my next question. Is there a one size fits all kind of approach, or do regulators need to take a differential view on all of these?
No, there is no one size fits all, unfortunately. I mean, counterfeit and spurious have to be dealt with at a different level, and NSQs have to be dealt with at a different level. The roles and responsibilities are different. The accountability is different. The solutions are also different. So let's look at the NSQ first. NSQ is basically a situation where non-standard drugs are being manufactured by a legitimate manufacturer. this drug fails to meet the regulatory standards. Who's accountable? The company which is manufacturing is accountable. What do they need to do? They need to follow the good manufacturing practices, good distribution practices, good storage practices. They need to undertake more frequent drug testing. They need to go to the labs and get this tested. If there are broken manufacturing processes, they need to fix them. The quality controls have to improve. All of those are interventions that are required by the manufacturer itself. The drug controller needs to make sure that these are fixed before the drug actually gets an approval. Periodic batch level testings have to be conducted, and in case any deviations are found, they have to be fixed with an iron hand so that the end quality is not compromised. So the intervention here is that of a company and then the sector. So you need to have industry associations which are actually propagating some of these GDPs and GSPs, which are the distribution and storage practices. Now, why I emphasize on distribution and storage practices is because unlike a number of other industries and pharmaceuticals, these are extremely important. Now, we know, during pandemic, India became the pharmacy to the world, and we manufactured the largest number of vaccines, which were transported all over the world. Now, those vaccines cannot just be transported in any container on any temperature range. There are temperature ranges in which the vaccine has to be maintained throughout the process of transportation. Now, you can't have a scenario where once the container got put on a truck, it can be maintained at room temperature. If you do that, then during that period, the efficacy of the vaccine would have been compromised. The end outcome would be significantly compromised. So throughout the entire process, right from the time that the drug leaves the manufacturer's facility all the way to the final point where the drug is consumed, the entire supply chain needs to be calibrated and maintained, managed a lot more closely than in a number of areas. It's possible that the drug was manufactured well, but during the process of transportation, distribution, and at the retail point, imagine power loss happened, the fridge in which the medicine was kept did not maintain the right temperature. Guess what will happen to the end outcome? So while the manufacturer is not to be blamed, but the end outcome was still, below par. So I think the solution there is of a different nature. The industry has to take greater accountability. It has to work with the logistics players. It has to develop better standards, better controls, better monitoring, management, reporting practices. So the onus squarely lies on the industry to deal with NSQ. But for spurious as well as for counterfeit, solutions are different. The state has to take care of some of this. We already see that a number of these counterfeit medicines come from certain cities in the country. There is no reason why the state should not increase its regulatory capacity, identify these manufacturers, the counterfeit ones and the spurious ones, and they crack down on them. They enforce the spirit of the law. They identify and root them out, make some cases out of them. There is enough teeth in the law. The drug and the acts have sufficient penalties in them to send some of these people behind bars for multiple number of years and impose strict financial penalties on them. Now, as an example, just for the NSQ portion, under the Drug and Cosmetic Act of 1940, a minimum of 1 year in prison, maximum of 2 years in prison, fine of 20,000, detention with a fine of 70,000, and many permutations and combinations of penalties are already prescribed in the law. It is very important that the regulator takes stock, creates regulatory enforcement capacity, goes after these counterfeit manufacturers and spurious manufacturers with the iron fist, makes examples out of them, sends some of these to behind bars so that it can make a case for others. Here, one manufacturer cannot do anything or the consumer cannot do anything because this is the law of the land problem where enforcement capacity is a problem. Now, on that, I do want to give some data here. For the capacity of India, at least 10,000 samples should be tested yearly, but our current capacity is not able to get to that number. We are probably doing about 1/3 of them. The number of inspectors that are supposed to be there per unit capacity in terms of manufacturing plants and retailers, the country has, most of the states do not even have 50% of that capacity today. So what ends up happening is the amount of regulatory intervention for enforcement to weed out some of these counterfeit and spurious manufacturers is often not taken up, and hence many of them, they fly under the radar. They are hand in glove with the retailers, and they make these supernormal profits at the expense of the consumer.
Right. So so the regulatory office does need to be strengthened in terms of human resource. Now, how this would often get interpreted is that, okay, now let's call for more compliances from companies, and put the onus on them to have their various parameters in place. So for those of us who don't, may not be familiar with the kind of compliances that happen, could you give us a small snapshot on what sort of compliances are there, say, on a mid-sized company in pharmaceuticals?
Sure. Great question, Jyoti, and this is a favorite topic of mine. The country has a very, very large ecosystem of compliances. And just to give your audience a view of that, we have 1,536 unique acts and rules. Subsumed in them are 69,233 unique compliances, 6,618 filings. For a small pharmaceutical company, let's see what it translates into. Now, small is one where they have one manufacturing plant in a single state operation. They employ, say, 100 people. Their revenues can be anywhere between 30-40 crores to, say, 100 crores, and they would fit into that MSME kind of a framework. For such a company, there are 998 unique compliances and close to 3,000 total compliances in a year. They need to deal with about 70 to 90 licenses give and take, depending on what specific drug they are manufacturing. There are at least 600 to 700 regulatory changes in a year that affect them. Now, if you break these numbers down, about 3,000 compliances in about 250 days in a year, they translate into a significantly high number of compliances per month. I mean, per day. I mean, you're looking at about 10 to 12 compliances in a typical day. There are licenses, 20, 25 licenses, which need renewal on an annual basis. There are at least 50 to 60 labor registers that they have to maintain, unique registers in different formats. There are a few hundred filings. When we did a quick assessment, at least one filing every 2 filings a day is what they need to take up. All of these are specific numbers on the compliance. So the solution to this is not to go and increase more compliances. We already deal with the regulatory cholesterol that needs to be rationalized. However, for managing 10% of the manufacturers which are engaged in these unlawful practices, we should not make life miserable for the remaining 90%. The country needs a shot in the arm. We actually need to rationalize some of the redundant, overlapping, and irrelevant compliances. A number of these laws were written in 1930s, 40s, and 50s. They still continue to be in vogue. While our world has changed, these laws have not changed. So the answer to this problem is not to throw the baby with the bathwater. We need to make sure that we segregate the intervention for the 10% versus the 90%. For 90%, the industry probably needs to take greater accountability. It needs to form better industry consortiums, like the SROs or something like that, where the good manufacturing, distribution, storage practices have to be evangelized. MSMEs have to be supported. Quality controls have to improve. The number of lab capacity for testing has to grow. Some of the smaller manufacturers need some more mentorship and guidance for better quality standards. So the interventions are not with the government for this area. For the 90%, the interventions have to be done by the large leading industry players so that the country's name is not tarnished in domestic as well as the international market. We know certain labels, when we hear made in certain countries, they are not taken very well. They come associated with poor quality. We don't want India's drugs to be perceived like that in the international market. Whereas for the 10%, government has to bring its shoulder to the load. Government has to increase its regulatory capacity. We've often seen that the country's ambition has skyrocketed. In the last 10, 15 years, the ambition, the overall scale has exponentially gone up, whereas our regulatory enforcement capacity continues to languish at the same level as it was 20 years ago. So we have to create greater regulatory capacity. The number of labs have to grow. The number of testing samples have to grow. Information asymmetry has to be killed. Today, you can't find relevant data on the regulator's website on what happened to certain samples when they were found to be spurious, NSQ, or counterfeit. We can't trace information. All that information has to become available on the regulator's website. We have to make cases out of the malicious actors. We have to make sure that some of them are sent behind bars, and there is an iron fist of the law that is at work as far as culling them out is concerned. So I think actions are not the same. These are two different problems and need two different actions. But the state certainly has to bring its weight and its regulatory enforcement capacity to bear.
Right. Absolutely. So one thing that when you speak to both the regulatory side and industry, two things that come up. One is states are competing with each other to give, have more manufacturing facilities, and so regulatory governance kind of falls through the cracks. And the second is, you need to be careful where you're buying from your medicines. That is, sometimes some may say a physical chemist at the end of your street might be more reliable. Someone else says the online digital pharmacies are better because they have a digital footprint. How would you weigh in on this?
So first of all, problem of plenty is a good problem to solve. I won't hold states, faulty on being ambitious, being hungry. I mean, I'm glad that certain states in the country, they're going all out to attract investment and create jobs. Now, one doesn't necessarily have to lead to the other. I mean, just because you are ambitious does not mean that you become a haven for poor standards and poor controls and bad quality. So I think we have to differentiate these two problems. I'm glad certain states are taking cognizance. They can see that pharmaceutical sector can provide large number of skilled jobs, white collar jobs, can contribute to their local as well as the national GDP and so on and so forth. However, with that said, certain controls and quality standards which are already prescribed in the law. I mean, we don't need to write new laws. Laws are already there. In fact, I've been making the case that some of these laws have overlap, redundancy, and they have to be rationalized. So all we have to do is, while we are growing aggressively and exponentially, we continue to focus on following the law in principle, in spirit, and make sure that the new capacity is not created at the cost of poor quality. Second, for the consumer, I think the system has to work in such a way that whether a consumer buys a particular medicine from a retail store near their residence or they buy it electronically, the quality comes assured. I mean, you can't hold the consumer accountable. Somebody is dealing with unfortunate, disease in the family. Some of them, these are life-threatening. Even if they are not life-threatening today, if not dealt with properly, they will become life-threatening soon. So I would not hold a consumer accountable for being sensitive and doing that due diligence and looking at the labels and samples and scanning some of these. I mean, some of the people say, let's put some QR codes and this and that. In a moment of truth, imagine somebody's near and dear one is hospitalized. I don't expect them to be scanning a QR code and going to a regulator's website and looking for a batch number. It is just not feasible, possible. And in a country of 140 crore people, where a large number of them still continue to reside in rural areas and may not have the education, sensitivity, awareness, or the savviness to deal with all of this, the quality has to come assured. It is the job of our system, which is manufacturers plus regulators plus government at center, state, and local body levels, to ensure that the 10% or so manufacturers which are engaging in these spurious activities are taken care of, brought to book, and made sure that the assurance in the system goes up dramatically.
That's well said. And that kind of takes care of my last question, which was, as consumers, sometimes we're also often told, listen, you go discount hunting. And so if you get a discount that's too good to be true when it comes to medicine, then you need to really watch out. So, sort of putting the responsibility back on consumers as well.
I don't agree with that. I mean, if I'm a consumer, I would want to find a source where I can get a medicine cheaper. Why would I pay more if I can get something for less? Now, that is not an excuse for manufacturers, retailers, distributors, suppliers to put counterfeit medicines or spurious medicines. If I can get the same tablet for lower, why won't I go and hunt for discounts? That doesn't make me accountable. Still, the accountability resides squarely on the regulator to ensure that the medicine which they are saying they are supplying is actually the correct medicine with the right active ingredients, with the right effectiveness, although at a cheaper price. Because as we know, drugs have commissions going up to 50 to 60% in a majority of the cases. So we need to make sure that our system works so that whatever is sold on the retail counter is not counterfeit and not spurious. I don't hold a consumer accountable for that.
It's a perfect note. I think we'll call this interaction to a close. Thank you so much, Rishi, for your time and insights. I do hope people in industry and the regulatory system tune into your views. Yeah, thank you so much.
Jyothi, thank you so much for having me here. Really appreciate it.